Great questions. Okay, well, the first one is I think entirely appropriate given where we're doing this forum, and it's the idea of intergenerational equity. Okay, we talk a lot about equity. Well, universities tend to. Actually, we have some of our gray-haired professors here, but we also have a lot of the future customers and consumers. And one of the questions we have is, have baby boomers underpaid? Has our generation, and I say that as a end of a baby boomer, if governments aren't collecting for whatever reason, and we're kind of passing on these costs to the future generation, is that an issue, and what can we do about it? So the rules are just one person speak at a time, but other than that, we can just share the mic. So Lynn, looks like
we may be all itching to answer this question, but I think there's a lot of underpayment going on, and maybe the biggest underpayment is that in terms of carbon. And if we like to think, even the most conservative, I think, among our national community, likes to think that we pay as we go, and that welfare is something that those are for the takers. But we have not shined a light on to what extent has our generation been takers that is leaving a real gap for our children and grandchildren. And I am looking forward to our conversation tomorrow about where environmental finance can go and how playing a role in making up that gap from the takers. So.
Anybody else? You don't have to. You can pass it on if anybody else wants to.
Somebody else probably. I'll take that on in one sense that I tend to agree with Lynn as a general matter, but I will say that one aspect of this that came up in the Environmental Financial Advisory Board had to do with the financing terms for loans for wastewater treatment, where you can get a 30-year loan on your house, but you couldn't get a 30-year loan on a wastewater treatment plant. And that seemed kind of an odd way to distribute generational equities. And so one of the things the board did was to point this out and suggest that we ought to look at longer financing terms that would both make the needed improvements more affordable and more appropriately demonstrate the generational equity in investing in infrastructures that are going to be around for a long time.
And something I see too, I wish we had more discussions around what is the value of these natural resources that we're protecting. You know, and I'm not just talking about the touchy-feely stuff here. I'm talking about the down and dirty economic value of what it means to have clean lakes, clean rivers, clean drinking water. What are the human health impacts of not having clean drinking water? So I think that's really, really vital. We had in the southwest corner of our state, we had a particular lake that was the #1 tourist draw in the entire state. You guys are pretty young, but some of you may know Branson. Okay, right around there. It developed quite a bit, and the lake was becoming kind of cloudy. The sport fishermen liked that. The bass were getting bigger, but it was not going to be sustainable in the long term. So that community, the communities surrounding that area that benefited so much, came and asked the regulators for additional regulation and looked for ways to finance that. And that was amazing, particularly because that is the most conservative portion of our state. So I think it's a great lesson, and we need to understand the value of what these resources mean to us as we decide what it is we can and will pay.
I want to say one thing, and that is, I know that we've talked a lot about specifically water resources, but this also goes for us into the area of transportation and transit, because, when you talk about health benefits and you talk about what you're paying for now, I mean, clearly is an area that's growing substantially. You've got a couple options. You can build a good public transportation system, or you can continue to be auto-dependent, and both of those have consequences. And that comes down often to the people well, I don't want to pay for it if I'm not, I'm not going to use it. But you're building a system. You're not just doing one piece. It's like roads. It's like water. I mean, you're building a system, and it's something that we all have to. It's back to that. Looking at today, but 30 years out too.
Great. Well, I think a number of you referenced the need for partnerships, working across boundaries. I think we had a very practical question about what type of skills makes for folks that can do that, and have you seen some examples and some of you did cite a few, but can you elaborate a little bit more? Because, this is editorial comment. Sometimes it's harder than it looks, pulling two groups together, whether they be a small town next to another town that's trying to share water. So just anything you can share from your experiences.
I'll just say at the beginning, it takes two things that seem contradictory. You both have to have somebody who's got enough training in the hard skills who understands the way market works, how you set rates, how you plan for capital investments so you know a system's going to need to be. But then you also, at the same time, you've got those sort of hard financial skills. You've also got to nurture the soft skills. How do you work with people? How do you collaborate? How do you understand what their interests are? How do you listen to what their true concerns are, and then work to try to find creative solutions? So it's sort of a combined hard, soft set of skills that you've got to have.
And I would agree with that. I'm going to specifically add humility and curiosity. You really need to understand and truly want to understand where they're coming from, and then be able to kind of take that and integrate it and see where the cross connections can be. But anyway, start with curiosity and with a good dose of humility.
Great. On a related note, I think there was some interest about this idea that citizens are willing to pay if you let them. And I think you cited, again, a few examples of citizens asking for regulation, or any other examples of, are we missing some of the signs out there that people are willing to pay more? Or have you had success stories? Are you getting a lot of people asking to increase their taxes so that you can?
That depends on who I'm talking to.
More frequent solid waste collection.
We did do the. Is it a penny for 100? I'm blanking, Dan. We have on the water bill. It's pretty insignificant, but we use it for like a watershed protection fee that we use. It's attached to the water bill, but we use it a lot for buying up those areas to really protect Falls Lake, which is our primary water source. I mean, it's basically cheaper to protect the water going in than to clean it up when it comes out. And it's kind of the bottom line. And I think, people understood that, and we really did not get pushback on that publicly or privately even. That went really, really well. I think that, certainly there's nothing like a drought to make people understand the value of water. So 2007, we had a pretty substantial drought. And, we did a lot of public education about water conservation, and people have maintained those habits. We use less water, now than per capita than we did 2001. So a lot of it is the way that you communicate.
I would completely agree with that, and I'll cite a couple of examples. One is in Georgia. The use of special purpose local option sales taxes has become something of favorite, but you really got to put the business case out there in ways that people understand what the value is. And in Florida, you've seen in a very conservative state with a very conservative governor, tremendous investments in the Everglades, and it was driven by a recognition that some of the consequences of not making those investments show up in impairments in places like Indian River Lagoon, and people start to make the connection between the investments you make and the environmental, the quality of the environment that they have. Now, they'd be the first to tell you they're not all the way there, but that communication is, Mayor, as you said, is tremendously important, and drawing a direct connection between the investment and the result.
Well, we had, changing gears a little bit, we had some very specific questions about what makes for a good green investment, what are green investments, and Alfred, particularly a question for you about the financial investors that you deal with that are investors. How are they viewing the environmental risk of what you're talking about? Is it just a question of transaction costs, or is there some inherent environmental risk that is making a financial investment a little unnerving? Thinking of just some of the environmental factors changing out there.
Yeah, so, and this will be a very general statement, and not to put anything on Val, but when Val speaks later, she may be able to answer some of the questions about some of the environmental issues. But so I guess there are a couple of parts to that question, and One is, are there investors in the market that are partly making the investments because they have a motivation to be, aside from making fair economic returns, that they believe that there are environmental risks out there and they want to do all they can to invest in things that can help overcome those risks, such if they have a view that there is global warming, and by having more clean energy we can reduce our impact and so forth. And the answer is yes, those parties are certainly out there. And we do find that generally the larger pocketed parties, they still want the business case, but those business cases are out there. And then I think maybe another part of the question to try to understand it is, for a particular project, are there certain environmental risks? And if the intent of the question is, are those risks analyzed prior to an investment? Yes, they are. And that's why I was thinking about Val, because I know her team spends a lot of time, thinking about those kinds of risks and potential outcomes for a project that a financial institution might get involved with. But from a setting all those things aside, from a direct investment standpoint, we're really more focused on, do we think the technology that's being deployed is going to work? Do we think the technology is going to work? So maybe you didn't hear anything I had to say.
But now the technology works.
That's okay. I didn't say much, but the sort of core of the kind of things I know about would be, will the technology work? That's a risk. And is it proven technology? Can we look at precedents? If it's, say, a solar facility, then how much is the sun going to shine? That's a risk, because if you're counting on certain cash flows based upon how much power you generate, you need to know how often will the sun shine and how little can it shine, and size your debt in that regard. And that's a project risk we have to evaluate. And then we have to evaluate if the sun shines and the panels produce energy, there's somebody that's supposed to buy the energy from us, and are they able? Do we think they can make payment when payment is due? And those are really the kinds of risks that that in my part of the business we focus on, and that most institutional investors are focused on. And there are lots of projects out there to be done where I think you get a nice, no guarantees, but you get a nice check in each of those boxes. And the entity I'm with and other similar entities are really trying to help make sure that more of those types of transactions actually get attention and get done.
So when we sell bonds to fund a pool of water and wastewater projects, we've tried to market a little bit toward the green community, the green investment community. Limited success so far in our case. I think that investor pool is expanding all of the time. Right now I think it's somewhat geographically limited. Or maybe it just isn't where I am, because when you think about a lot of investors, when they're buying tax-exempt bonds, they're looking for that tax exemption, and they're going to look for it on the state side and on the federal side. So our best borrowers are going to be Missouri-based investors. They're going to get the best bang for their buck. And so maybe it's just where we live. Maybe there aren't so many green investors where we live. But there are projects now that are being marketed just to green investors. And I think, was it Massachusetts, Jeff, that had a sale of some water and wastewater bonds last year. They very aggressively marketed it to the green investment community and did a pretty nice job. There's a lot of good reasons to do that. One very good reason to do that, not only is it the right thing to do, but it also, as far as being the bond issuer, I really like to diversify the portfolio of people who own our bonds. I want more investors. There's more competition for my bonds, so I get a lower interest rate. So it's always good to look for those markets that may be buying those things. And I think the green market is one that's certainly developing.
And if I may, I'm certainly no expert on bonds, but I think this is where we will hopefully see some changes as time goes by, because just because something is a water infrastructure investment does not mean that it's necessarily in the long-term interests of sustainability. And there are a lot of changes afoot, especially in wastewater treatment, that are one. I think that if one has true green and sustainable interests, we need some measures to shine some light on the different types of wastewater, for instance, investments. Is a deep tunnel the same kind of going to give you the same return on investment, on environmental return on investment as green infrastructure or nutrient recycling techniques and that sort of thing? So there are a lot of options on the table that we don't yet have good sunshine on in terms of how they rate out for long-term sustainability.
Well, I think you mentioned green infrastructure several times. I think there was a specific question for Karen again about Missouri. Have you been involved in financing green infrastructure, and what does that look like? And then while you're at it, someone was also curious how you take in potential weather changes, climate change. You talked about populations that are going to be different in the future. How about the weather in those towns that are going to be different in the future?
Well, we're definitely struggling with the weather issues. I mean, we have droughts, we have floods, we have tornadoes. So encouraging communities to build their infrastructure in ways where they're resilient, where they can sustain those or sustain those better, is certainly an emphasis that we're trying to put on projects. But it's difficult, quite frankly. Green infrastructure, we do better sometimes than others, and there's lots of definitions of green infrastructure. And again, just sort of bringing it back to, I talked a lot about the rural communities. Green infrastructure in a rural community means something very different to green infrastructure in an urban community. So looking at that, it's a tough balancing act a lot of times.
Well, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and throw a question out that Lynn will sound familiar because we were in a group talking about it quite a bit last week. But there's this concept that the traditional environmental utility model is showing signs of wear and tear. You hear the utility model being broken in the energy field. A lot of water and wastewater managers are concerned about the blend of their revenue from selling more water to their costs going up, but they're selling less water. I was struck when you said the city's not showing you a lot of love, McFarlane, for your cistern. So to take this level, I think part of the issue is if everybody in Raleigh or in another city built cisterns, what would be your vision for that? Would that be a governmental issue where you wrapped it up? Would it be a private sector issue? How would that fit in this new model? Does anybody have suggestions? As a funder, as a local government?
Can I put the mic to Dan? It's certainly, a couple people in the audience have been part of the city conversations about exactly how do we do that or incentivize. And I know that that's not only with the water and the cisterns, but we're also having the conversations about the power and how do we engage citizens with that, whether it's personal solar systems and that getting power to and from the grid. I know that the North Carolina League of Municipalities is currently engaged with the Utilities Commission looking at a new model for that. And I don't see Paul Meyer. I think he's going to be here after the break. He's going to speak to that a little bit. And I don't know if Dan wants to say anything more about that. I don't really know a lot of details, but I know that that's something that they're looking at as their ways for private citizens to engage with the energy structure for the state of North Carolina with the Utilities Commission.
Yeah, at the Johnson Foundation at Wingsburg, where I work, what we do for our business is bringing people together to work through sort of thorny and difficult issues, and this is one of them that Jeff is referring to, a meeting that we had last week, not the first time we've pulled people together around this supposed challenge of declining revenue because of declining water. I'm trying to put quotes around sales because it's not really sales, but and what that, it's very disruptive to the utility, and it's very parallel to the challenges around the disruptions in the energy generation field. And the same thing's happening in sewage. We don't hear a lot about it, but there's less sewage going through the system. And from an environmental perspective, from societal perspective, you think these are good things, right? But they're not necessarily in the utility's short-term interest. And so we get this conflict of interest between the utility, which in theory belongs to all of us, it's our utility, right? And what the community's long-term interests are. And we held a meeting at Wingspread a couple of weeks ago on distributed infrastructure, which is one of these things that's causing disruption to these business models. And the utilities that are, some utilities are really challenged by this and kind of fighting it and kicking and screaming, and others are looking to it saying, this is the future we have, and what can we do to change our business model so that we're relevant in this new future? So, for instance, hearing from the utility director at Spartanburg, South Carolina, how she's working with her industrial partners to if they're going to do water recycling for their source of a lot of their processed water, she wants to be the one who's overseeing that and helping them with that. It's not running through her treatment plant. The treatment plant is now in this private location, but she's providing that expertise. And there are models out there with electric distribution where it may be centrally managed or centrally maintained, even though the ownership is distributed. And so I think we have to start looking at these new business models that align with our long-term sustainability. And remember that the utility is there to serve us, not just to survive and be its own. The survival of the utility in and of itself is not our goal. It's providing these services in a way that's not only financially sustainable but environmentally sustainable.
Great. Last word, Stan.
And I'm glad to see the connection between the cisterns and the energy efficiency, because that really is the same thing. 2 quick points. One is that this phenomenon is also happening with gasoline consumption. Gasoline consumption in this country is dropping, and highway improvements have been paid for years by gasoline taxes. And so that means you start going to different models there. Interesting development. And secondly is that the Kemper Power Plant in northeastern Mississippi, which is the one which has carbon capture that will go online sometime in the late summer this year, is getting all of its makeup water from the city of Meridian. And they built a 30-mile pipeline to send Meridian's wastewater out to this plant. The plant itself is a zero-discharge plant. So interesting model on, I don't know quite what that would fall as a model, but it's an interesting new model on how you do things.
Great. Well, I want to thank our first round of speakers wholeheartedly. And